People say they're fed up with paying too much for electricity, and lawmakers want to give state regulators more power over the utility companies. Senator Norm Needleman is the chair of the legislature's Energy Committee, which has been pushing for change. And we want to thank Senator Needleman for being here today on Face the State.
How are you today?
I think everyone is very concerned about their energy bills, their electricity bills. There's a lot going on right now. Tell me about the legislature and your committee and some of the bills that you would like voted on sooner than later.
Yeah, so we introduced the Take Back Our Grid Act and followed it up with draft legislation and followed it up with a public hearing. And now we're in the final phases of negotiating what the final bill will look like. I believe that we should, finalize the bill within the next week. We're working in consultation with certainly with my co-chair, our ranking members, and as well as all the affected parties. So we listened to the public hearing, and we're going to come up with a final bill.
I know it's never simple to boil down legislation, but if you could tell us what are the top two things that you hope comes out of this legislation?
I'm hoping that we get performance-based standards for rate making. I think is a critical thing, and I think everybody agrees on that. Two things is really hard, but more accountability. Certainly, we want restitution, and if we could get it back for the prior storm in recognition of all the people that have been hurting, we want to try to get that done.
During several hearings, and I know your committee has held hearings this week, we heard from the state regulators, PURA. They are also having their own investigations. And we've heard it over and over again that the utility companies are more focused on profits and their shareholders and not on the ratepayers. You've said that, right? You're very concerned about that?
Well, I think that my expectation is that we come out the other side of this with a utility that acts more like a utility and a little bit less like a hedge fund, and more focused on the ratepayers of Connecticut, and a little bit less focused on their shareholders. They don't act like a utility at this point. They do what they can to meet standards within the utility sphere, but boy, they generate a lot of profits and pay themselves really well. And I want to make sure that whatever they do it fairly for the ratepayers of Connecticut.
Right, because the deal I understand that Eversource has with Connecticut is that they are guaranteed a 9.25% rate of profit. But what happens if things, are bad and it doesn't necessarily translate into lower rates for customers, right?
Right, and I look, there's a lot that goes into the rates that people pay. Connecticut has a lot of forward-thinking plans with regard to renewable energy, as well as things that help poor people and middle-income people. So we don't want to lose any of that. That's an important part of it. But not everything that they do should have a margin on it. And I think one of the things we're looking to do is empower PURA with some additional tools to make sure that they're held more accountable. And PURA has latitude in that rate of return. I hope that they visit that and make sure that that's an appropriate rate of return to do the capital investments necessary to have a 21st century grid, as well as the things that are necessary to keep our rates down. So it's finding a sweet spot. Connecticut is Connecticut, and we're trying to figure out what the best way to do that is.
Right. PURA told us this week they could use some more tools in their toolbox. So you're trying to get them that.
Our bill has that.
Also, Con Edison, after the storm that we witnessed, Isaias, back in August, gave refunds to their customers, people who were without power, I believe, for more than 72 hours. They got, I think, up to $500 for things like medicine and food that was spoiled because they had no refrigerator power. Eversource has not agreed to do that, but that's something that you'd like to see going forward?
Absolutely. And that was, we put in some pretty onerous stuff in the first draft of the bill, and I had hoped that on some level we could shame them into volunteering for some of that. Con Ed was the perfect point counterpoint, and Eversource just didn't do that. look, I don't think everybody in the state of Connecticut should put their hand out. There are a lot of people for whom that kind of a loss is not that significant, but we have so many people in Connecticut for whom $200 or $400 or $500 is the difference between making ends meet and not, and it's worse during a pandemic. So they need to do something, and we want to make sure that hopefully they do it retroactively, and then going forward that there are some provisions in there for Pura to make that happen as part of their general oversight.
I think a lot of people want to know what's realistic. I mean, legislation gets proposed all the time. It gets watered down. Maybe it doesn't make it through both chambers. And I think the bottom line is that people in Connecticut pay some of the highest prices in the country for their electricity. And at the end of the day, they're seeing their rates go up and up and up. And they're not necessarily guaranteed better service. I mean, people were without power for several days during the August storm. So what really can come out of this?
Well, as I've said to them during the hearings and in private, my job is to make sure they do the best job possible. Now, we put in a mandated 72-hour restoration without penalties. They spent a lot of time responding to that specific issue. I'm not sure that is that realistic. However, what can they do to make an 8-day outage, a 6-day outage, or a 5-day outage? And I would argue that a shift in philosophy, better communication, which they even now admit had completely collapsed, needs to be revisited. And we want to make sure that any outages are as short as possible. We want to make the grid as resilient as possible. We want to make the restoration equitable for all the people in Connecticut and not have Northwestern Connecticut out, for extra time as the rest of the state was coming back on. It just didn't seem like things were done equitably. And we want to make sure that their focus is not numbers on the board, but people and the people who need their power the most. You can't restore one person at a time, but they need to do a better job.
Right. I know communication is key. A lot of town leaders, including yourself, were frustrated because they weren't able to get much information about where the crews were, and there seemed to be quite a few delays.
Absolutely. And, this is not my first rodeo with them. I've gone through multiple storms, and I would say that the consolidation of their emergency operations centers as a specific thing led to less communication between the town CEOs and emergency management directors and the company. And they've acknowledged that that's been a flaw. So hopefully they will have a slightly more decentralized operation going forward. They operate as though they are a big city utility, which is the genesis of the company's current management. They need to understand that we are a state with 169 towns, and it may be more complicated than just being, Boston Edison. We are a much more complicated place to deal with.
State Senator Norm Needleman, we thank you for joining us here on Face the State. I know you want to vote this month. It may not happen until early next year, but we hope you'll come back and share an update with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan.
When we come back, Hartford had to cancel school the very first day because of cyber attacks. How can schools fight back?